Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Crew Resource Management Principles and Practices. We're going to review the critical decision-making process this afternoon. You can follow along in Chapter 4 of your Crew Resource Management Principles and Practice textbook if you like. The objectives for today's lecture, we're going to describe the role of conflict in the decision-making process. We're going to describe the role of crew resource management in an event-driven scenario, and we're going to describe the risks and rewards of the decision-making process itself. First off, we need to understand a complex process. What is a complex process? Many factors influence how teams and individuals make decisions in dynamic environments. And when I say a dynamic environment, I'm talking about the environment that we in EMS work in. Things change rapidly. We get called to the scene of X and then it turns into the scene of Y. It's a minor car accident and then you get there and there are 15 patients laid out on the highway. Things change. You've got a patient who seems okay when you arrive, but as the call progresses, they get progressively worse and worse and worse throughout the call. So your decision-making process becomes a little more urgent as the call progresses. It's dynamic, things change. Conflict produces that emotional response in all of us that kind of sharpens how we think and makes us focus on the decision ahead of us and how we're going to get there and what alternatives there are to the path that we're currently on. If I'm following the respiratory distress protocol and guideline and I'm going down that algorithm, but suddenly decide I need to be in the pulmonary edema algorithm instead, as the person who's in charge of taking care of that patient, I need to be thinking 3 steps ahead in my decision-making process so that I know I may need to switch gears here shortly. That's part of the conflict. I see one thing initially, I know it's going south and may go a different direction. That's my conflict. It's described, it can be the actual conflict, or it can just be perceived opposition of needs, values, interest, whatever. But that conflict does exist. We all need to understand, as part of the critical decision-making process, there's going to be a certain amount of conflict, and that conflict actually does have a positive role, or potentially has a positive role, in making those decisions. Everyone on our team that responds to that call has got a different background, they have different experiences, they have different technical skills. As I like to say, they all bring their own special toolbox to the decision-making process. We need to understand that time and pressure and circumstances beyond our control are going to hurry and rush the decisions we make. So sometimes we may not make the best decision when we're under those sorts of pressures, and we need to accept that fact, that time and pressure is going to affect the quality of the decisions we make. That we may have to back up at some point in the process and reevaluate, but we need to understand that that's going to be a factor. And we need to understand that everybody on the team, every individual on the team, those conflicts that we have with one another are going to be evident to everybody else. Our body language, how we respond to one another, our facial expressions, and our just outright behaviors towards our team members are going to project the conflicts we have with other folks. And we need to make sure that we keep that conflict well managed to keep it a healthy environment. You don't have to agree with your partner. You don't have to have the same political views. You don't have to have the same social views. But those outside conflicts have to be controlled and maintained so that they don't affect the decision-making process for the patient in front of us. Healthy cultures embrace open communication and we allow for dialogue. We want that dialogue to exist. We want the new guy to be able to talk to the chief on the department, to have that conflict, or to have that open line of communication so that they can work through the communication process of making decisions and understanding one another's thought processes. The chief may see things one way, the new guy, the rookie who's fresh out of school and got all the newest textbook knowledge may see it from a different perspective. That communication needs to be open and respected and allowed so that the two of them, or the group as a whole, can come together and make a decision based on everyone's knowledge. But we need to keep that dialogue respectful. We can't be, snarky with one another. We can't call each other names behind their backs, and we can't look down on folks for their opinions or their decisions or their thought processes. We need to be curious about not only what we think and how we think, but we need to be curious about how other people think and what their knowledge base is. And we need to be curious about how that knowledge base can be applied to what we already know or what we already think we know in order to improve and expand our knowledge and our ability to make decisions in the future. We also have to remember that not every time we make a recommendation for a solution to a problem is it going to be accepted. At some point, the default leader of the team is going to make a decision that may or may not agree with what we personally think is the best solution. If that team leader's process doesn't pan out and the ending to the mission is not as successful as we had hoped, we still need to be supportive of that team leader. We can't look down on them and say, hey, no, I told you that was gonna happen, you should have done my thing. That's not respectful. That doesn't build team confidence. That doesn't build team rapport. We need to be able to step back and say, hey, you tried, you did your best, you followed the decision process you thought was best for this mission. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. Let's step back and together as a group, look at the whole situation in our post-incident analysis and figure out what we can do in the future that might make the same situation have a better, more positive outcome. We need as a team to share not only our successes, but we also need to share our failures. And when we have failures, we need to share them and we need to turn them into a positive. We need to figure out the solutions. Break. Event-driven scenarios in crew resource management, the scenes that we respond to are very dynamic. We may get called to a respiratory distress at 3 o'clock in the morning, and in our minds, we know we're gonna go there, we're gonna put the patient on a cardiac monitor, we're gonna put them on a pulse ox, we're probably gonna give them a little bit of oxygen, maybe they're gonna get an IV, they're gonna get medication XYZ based on their history and their current symptoms. The problem is, that's what we're going to, that's what we were dispatched to, but when we arrive, we may find something totally different. Those dynamic scenes that unfold in front of us and change in front of us or change while we're en route to the call are out of our control. We can't always control what's going to happen prior to our arrival. Okay? Things happen. It's just part of life. It's part of EMS. It's part of public service. So we need to be able to respond to that dynamic situation with dynamic decision making, as I like to call it. Everybody on that scene is going to have a different perspective based on their role. Okay? You've got certain people with certain expertise. Certain folks are going to be better at airway management. Certain folks are going to be better at IVs. Some folks are better at pharmacology. Everybody's going to have a little different level of experience. You've got, the chief who's been there for 40 years, and you've got the rookie who's, still trying to dry the ink on his EMT card. We all have different levels of training. You're going to have EMTs, you're going to have paramedics, you're going to have first responders, you're going to have guys there with no EMS training whatsoever. We're all going to have a different recall level. Okay? Certain folks are better at just recalling protocols and procedures and dosing and pharmacokinetics and all. They're just better at that than others. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there are people who are a whole heck of a lot better at that than most of us. Okay? And there's going to be some personal context to every call that is going to affect how we respond and how we think. Okay? Once we have a solid foundation of what's going on, once we get on scene and we say, okay, this is a respiratory distress, it's cardiogenic in nature, he's got CHF, he's got fluid buildup, this is the path we're going to go down. Because that initial call, we may know nothing more than a person with difficulty breathing, so our repertoire of potential problems is about this wide. But once we get on scene and we narrow that down a little bit and we have that solid base and we see the problem, then we can start making some decisions a little more appropriately for that patient. And then with a high performance team where everybody's involved and everybody's helping make decisions and everybody's throwing in their expertise and knowledge, then that high performance team can work best because they work collectively. Once they're there, part of crew resource management, everybody must know the nature of the problem. Okay, we all know that this is a respiratory distress and this guy's got CHF and he's got fluid buildup in his lungs. So we know the nature of the problem. We have to know each other's strengths and weaknesses and who can be depended upon to do what and who's going to do what skills, who's going to do what tasks. If you've got someone who's particularly good at pharmacology, then they need to be responsible for pharmacology. If you've got someone who's particularly good at airway management, then they need to manage that airway. As a team, we need to know what's going to happen to this patient if we don't do anything. He's going to die. And we know what would most likely happen to this patient if we followed a particular algorithm or we followed a particular course of treatment. Or if it's an accident scene, if we enter the car this way, what's going to happen? As a team, we need to know that. Okay? In particular, when you get into situations like car accidents out on the highway and you've got 7 or 8 people surrounding a car that's unstable, we all need to know what may or may not happen if we do certain things. If we open a door without securing the car, without cribbing it up, what's going to happen to the guy on the other side when the car rolls over? Okay? We need to be aware, we need to be situationally aware. We all need to have that shared common knowledge of a desired outcome. For most of our cases, that's a positive patient outcome at the end when we get to the hospital. The cardiac arrest patient has a spontaneous return of circulation. Hopefully they're neurologically intact. That car accident, the trauma patient gets to the hospital, they haven't bled out, they haven't dissected their aorta. We've gotten them there alive so that the trauma teams can take care of them. We all know initially what that desired outcome is and what we want it to be, but we need to have a shared strategy of how we're going to get there. How are we going to get from point A to point Z and the 23 steps in between? What are we going to do as a group? What is our shared strategy for getting there? Most of that will just kind of fall in place, especially if you've been with a team for a long time. You'll know what you do. Everybody has their role. Everybody has the things that they do. They just follow the algorithm that we've always done. But everybody on that team has to be able to know that if they see something funny or if something is not going the way that we as a team want it to go, that they can speak up and say, I don't think this is what we want to do, or I think we need to do this instead, and this is why. Okay? And that's when we talk about communications and appropriate communications. When a crew knows how to use crew resource management, we can use it to maximize our success and our long-term outcomes for our missions. We practice and we have the knowledge that is required to develop and cultivate a shared vision so we all know what we want at the end. That vision is key, whether it's leadership or it's the mission right in front of us. The vision of where we need to be at the end is the key. Everybody on the team should know when they need to say, whoa, we're veering off from that end point. We want to be over here and we're going to the left about 15 degrees. Everybody needs to be able to say, we're not getting there. We need to slow down, regroup, and reconsider what we're doing and possibly change the process to which, in order to get us there. There are key factors in the decision-making efforts that we go through. Decisions are driven by our own behaviors and our own reactions to the situation we're in. Each one of those performance behaviors is a measure of a cognitive control that may be beneficial to the situation or it may truly be harmful to the situation. That cognitive control is the collection of brain activities that we have that's responsible for planning and our cognitive flexibility, our ability to kind of look at a situation and say, no, that's not where I need to be over here, or that was a great path yesterday, but because it's raining so hard today that we maybe need to veer a little bit. Or our ability to think outside the box and think abstractly. The ability to look at the rules and the policies and the procedures and say, yes, they apply here, or no, they don't. And how to initiate appropriate responses and actions to a particular scene. Those are all under our cognitive control, where we consciously can control those things and make the problem go away, hopefully. Rule-based analysis is wonderful. It's wonderful decision making for those folks who have time to think a problem through. Unfortunately, in the dynamic world we live in, we don't always have that luxury. Rule-based analysis is very labor intensive. It requires you to have a problem that's going to give you a significant amount of time to resolve it. It lets everybody evaluate all of the different options to solving the problem ahead of time, or not necessarily ahead of time, but to sit down and resolve, or to look at all of the different options there are to resolving that problem. It allows you to reach out and capture knowledge from other folks. You don't know the structure of this building. It was built in the 1900s. You remember studying balloon framing, but you really don't know that much about it. So you find somebody on the department or somebody in the city engineer's office who's an expert on balloon framing and whether this building may or may not have it. You pull those folks in, but you have time to pull those folks in. Okay. In a dynamic situation that most of us work in, we don't really have that time to call in the experts and to sit back and relax and make decisions essentially by committee. Okay. Recognition prime decision making is very quick, and it's for the most part very effective when we're faced with dynamic and complex situations, and you kind of develop over time your ability to do this. You see this more in the veterans than you will in the rookies, because they've been there, they've done that, they've seen this problem, they've faced it before, and they've solved this problem before. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. Sometimes they've learned from poor decisions on what they would do the next time they were faced with this particular situation. It's developed over time, mostly used by frontline operators, or those of us who are on the front lines day to day, dealing with fires and medical situations. And you develop that through continuous exposure. For the veterans, you develop that with continuous exposure to the patients. To some of our newer folks, you develop that hopefully coming out of school through your high fidelity simulation training, so that you recognize things before you see them in real life. But making those decisions has a requirement of having some expertise and knowledge of the situation at hand before you ever get there. So you have to be able to recognize what's going on, and you realize that it's an urgent situation and that you have to make a decision now. You don't have the time to sit back, relax, and evaluate what's going on. Those of us on the front lines don't always have time to sit down and analyze all of the options out there. So we'll pattern match, okay? We see, if we're talking about the house fire situation, we'll walk up to the front door of the house that we know is on fire because we've been called there and there's smoke. But we look up at the eaves and we see the smoke kind of drifting in and out of the eaves. We recognize that, if you've got any fire experience, as a bad thing. If you don't recognize that, you may go bursting through the front door and get blasted in the face with a lot of heat and flame. But you match the patterns. You more appropriately for EMS, we walk into the house and into the living room and we see Joe laying on the floor. He's gray, he's obviously not breathing. We pattern match that in our brain. We've seen this before, we know what it is. This guy's probably in cardiac arrest. EMTA, get down there and open the airway and start bagging them. EMTB, start doing chest compressions. EMTC, you start looking for an IV. EMTD, you start setting up for airway management. E, you start setting up for drug therapy. EMTF, you start setting up for electrical therapy. We all just kind of, and we don't have to say that, we just all kind of do our thing, okay? We pattern match, we walked in the room, we saw the problem, we all knew through experience what needed to happen, we all knew what our jobs were going to be, we go straight to it. Okay, we apply previous knowledge, previous experience. And that's really, really easy to do when you've done it a dozen times or 12 dozen times. Not necessarily so easy to do when you've only done it once or you've never done it before. Very familiar to the veterans in the business, not always so familiar to the folks who are just getting started out, but you'll get there pretty quickly especially if you're in a high volume system. One of the keys, though, is that you have the ability to kind of separate into two patterns or into two categories, those truly life-threatening emergencies and those non-life-threatening emergencies. In our world, you're going to throw it into this is an emergency, this is life and death, I need to intervene immediately, and the other category where you can kind of sit back, relax, and make some conscious decisions, evaluating the situation as those not so life-threatening emergencies where you may have a little more time. Okay. What we're going to do afterwards is that post-incident analysis, and we're all going to get together and we're going to sit back and we're going to look at what happened. We're going to start at point A and we're going to get to point Z, and we're going to look at every point in between and every decision that was made and kind of figure out where we veered off path, what we could have done to make better decisions and how we would have made those decisions. And sometimes we're going to have folks who are very black and white and they only see the algorithm and they don't want to deviate off of it. But we may need to help them understand that not every time is that initial algorithm and that initial pathway that you're following the appropriate pathway, and that sometimes we need to go back and reevaluate continuously through the process and through the call so that we ultimately end up at the appropriate end, at the mission end. There are certain risks and rewards that come along with the decision-making process. In teams, we develop patterns and rules to apply to dynamic environments to help, from our previous experience, to help us get to the end goal, to the end of the mission. Those patterns and responses that we have pre-programmed in our brains help us simplify what's going on around us and help keep us from having to relearn the mundane tasks and the redundant strategies of the everyday call. We do patient assessment the same way every time. We always do it, A, B, C, D, E, regardless of the patient, regardless of what's wrong with them. Even if we don't outwardly do some of those steps, internally we do some of those steps. If I walk up to a patient and he's having a conversation with me and it's appropriate, I know he's alert, I know he's breathing, and I know he's got a heartbeat. I don't necessarily know the quality of those things, but I know those 3 boxes are checked. Okay? But I always do that. That helps me and everybody else kind of stay in tune to how we're going to, in tune to the decision-making process down the road. But we look for different patterns in everything that we experience, and those different patterns are what's going to help us kind of veer to a different decision-making process or to a different algorithm. The drawbacks to these pattern recognitions is that not every initial pattern that we recognize is going to be the path that we need to be going down. We may walk in and decide this patient is in respiratory distress, but we don't necessarily know why. So we may go down the dyspnea algorithm because that's where we're at. That's what we recognize. As we start doing our assessment and we begin bringing in more clues and signs and symptoms and get a little more in depth into this patient interview, we're going to start to recognize other things and other keys that may lead us down another path. So as we continue our investigation of this patient's complaint, we will see that our initial decision was not necessarily correct, and now we need to kind of veer off in another direction. If we stick with that initial decision, we may seriously mistreat our patient because we've lost our collective understanding, either individually or as a group, as to what's really going on. You may have some conflict amongst team members based on experience, based on exposure to these patients. Some folks will more quickly just naturally pick up on what's wrong with a patient, whereas some folks who've got a little less experience may not pick up so quickly as to dynamically what's wrong with the patient. And they're still on algorithm A when the guy that's been there 20 years and seen all this is already on algorithm C or D because he's picking up some of those clues that the newer guys may not necessarily pick up. Teams develop patterns and rules to apply to dynamic situations that they've gathered and garnered together through previous experience. And it helps them simplify the surroundings that they're in. It helps teams keep from having to relearn the mundane. It helps teams identify situations much more quickly and not have to go through those first initial outward steps of the decision-making process. You can walk into a room and that patient is awake and alert and talking to you, you know he's breathing and he's got a heartbeat. So you can kind of sort of skip the A part. But you gather that experience over time as to what parts of assessments you can kind of breeze through and what parts you can't breeze through. And we all look for those different patterns that help guide us through our decision-making process, but that all comes through experience. You don't necessarily achieve that straight out of school. Sometimes we see patterns where they don't really exist. We have to be very cognizant of that. We'll start going down path A because that's what we were led to believe. A lot of times we will be dispatched to a call and we have that mindset already of this is what I'm going to and this is the algorithm I'm going to follow because this is what I'm being dispatched on. And although it may be close, like we discussed the other day in class, that guy's drunk, this is how I'm going to treat him. Well, in reality, he's got a closed head injury. So we need to realize that not every pattern we initially recognize or we think we recognize or we force ourselves to recognize is necessarily the truth. So we may have to regroup. That can lead to serious issues. The Rosenbaum story that we talked about in class last week, they went into that situation with a preconceived idea of what was wrong, and unfortunately for the patient, it didn't work out so well because they followed the wrong path. We may see the picture differently when you have conflict amongst team members who have different levels of experience, different levels of training. What I see and what you see may not necessarily be the same thing, just because we perceive things differently. So we need to realize that there's the potential for conflict there, and that we need to be able to work through that pretty quickly on the scene. Unfortunately, when we're in those time compressed situations, that's not always the easiest thing in the world to do. We can go back and look at it post-incident and kind of figure out where those errors occurred. But when things are happening quickly, we can't always necessarily figure out right away what that differing viewpoint is and why you see one thing one way and I see one thing another way. We may have to just go back after in the post-incident analysis and look at it again to help us come together as a team to decide, oh, well, the third view is actually what was really, that neither of us truly saw. You see one thing, I see another thing, and the reality is put that together and a third solution pops up. We need to honestly exchange ideas when there's a conflict and when there's an issue between team members, when we're making decisions. Sometimes the scene is not the most appropriate time to do that. Sometimes it is, just kind of depends on the situation. We each kind of have to figure that out for ourselves, and a lot of it, if there's a definite your partner or you is going to injure the patient, then yes, somebody needs to intervene right away. If it's just a minor difference of opinion, then no, we can deal with that after the fact. The power of recognition, prime decision making comes from the model not relying on perfection. Okay, we know going in that what we're doing is not going to be perfect, and we may have to make some adjustments down the road. Okay? A critical decision process that's formed by plausibility, what most likely is going to happen or is going on, an understanding of the situation, some general coherence amongst the team members as to what's going on in this situation, and our ability to invent solutions. How are we going to fix this? Are we going to do process A or are we going to do process B? And the flexibility of ourselves and of our partners to making those decisions and looking and chasing those solutions is very important to the recognition prime decision-making process and the critical decision-making process. When we review performance, we need to understand certain things. That first of all, critical decision-making is primarily intuitive. Critical decisions, especially in our world, happen in a very dynamic environment and happen very quickly. Okay? So it's primarily intuitive. Do I do option A or do I do option B? We may have to go back later and relearn from our decisions as to whether or not we made the correct decision and how we're going to change that in the future. Implementing crew resource management can fail in an organization that doesn't understand the process of decision making. Crew resource management is great, but people need to understand that sometimes we're going to make the incorrect decisions. Okay, so we need to be able to look back, look in retrospect at what decisions were made, figure out how they could have been made better, figure out what the alternatives could have been, and adjust our stories in the future and our policies in the future to fix things that have happened in the past. It's very dynamic, it's very flexible, it's an ongoing process. There's no one answer on any given day. Everybody is held accountable for what they do at that time, especially in time-compressed events when there's very little concrete information available and it's very dynamic. We can't always hold somebody 100% accountable for what they did at that very moment. They did the best they could. They made the best decision they could at the time. We can look at it, we can Monday morning quarterback it and say, well, it was very obvious the decision they should have made, but they may not have had all of the information that we have on Monday to make that decision. So we need to recognize that, we need to be accepting of that, and we need to use that as part of our process for improvement in the future. We need to make sure that we maintain context when we're evaluating these situations. We need to analyze how the decisions were made. We need to look at what the operators in that particular situation knew, what their expertise was, what their training level was. Would they have done the same thing that any other person with their same level of training and knowledge and expertise would have done? Or did they do something completely oddball that nobody would have expected? One of the advantages of high fidelity training is that we can kind of build that experience in to the new guy. They don't necessarily have all of the experience from reality, but high definition simulation training is pretty realistic anymore, and we can kind of work the kinks out and give the newer guys with less experience a knowledge base that 20, 30 years ago we may not have had. So that may also be a solution to some of these decision-making problems. In summary, we need to realize that conflicting viewpoints are a normal part of decision-making. Everybody on the team, if you've got 2 people on the team, are going to conflict at some point. If you've got 8 people on the team, you're definitely going to conflict at some point. Over time, as those teams build cohesion, that conflict will reduce because you'll develop as a team and you'll develop a process for working through problems together. Good teams understand that conflict's going to occur. They're going to understand that it's part of the decision-making process, and that it's important that they use that conflict to vet out other options and other solutions to the problems they face that they may not see on a day-to-day basis. Everybody needs to be respectful. We need to keep our communications respectful and our dialogue respectful, and we need to be able to communicate up and down the chain and across the chain without any hard feelings or anybody feeling like they're being disrespected or not heard. Everybody has different perspectives, and based on their experience and training, their differencing ability to recall procedures in their personal context when they look at a call or when they go to a call. So everybody's going to respond a little bit differently. Everybody's going to think a little bit differently. That's normal. We just need to all work together to kind of bring all of those differing views together to make one big solid team. Previous experience situations help us develop our responses and patterns to respond to certain dynamic situations, but we need to be aware that during those dynamic situations we still need to be stopping and looking at them and reevaluating them and possibly changing course as to how we're going to get from point A to point Z and all the steps in between. Okay, that was a quick look at the critical decision-making process, and have a great day.